And thank you to each of you. Gosh, we already have over 100, almost 150 participants today. Thank you for joining online today and choosing to spend the better part of an hour with us exploring 5 steps to strengthen your organization and impact through volunteer engagement in 2025. As Court mentioned, we are remarkably almost already done with Q1, quarter one of 2025, and yet it still feels a little bit like the start of a year. And usually the start of a year inspires us to look ahead with an air of new possibilities. And yet in many parts of the world, this year has kicked off with more than the usual amount of uncertainty. And as related to the book that I was so privileged to be able to contribute to and put together and edit, we know that uncertainty and disruption can naturally lead some of us to step back with like a wait and see approach. Let me just see how things play out. Let's wait for things to simmer down. And yet, a more impactful approach really is to step forward, to use our influence for positive impact in our organization and in our communities. And so what we're hoping to cover today, what we plan to cover today are some ideas, some research, some resources, and 5 steps to help us take that step forward into action, into influence, to take time away from our daily actions, as my mentor used to say, the tyranny of the urgent, and actually think about our strategy, think about our organization, both from sort of this organization-wide 20,000 foot level, but also looking at our actions personally and what can be our personal strategies for professional development as well, so that we can strengthen our organizations through the power of volunteer engagement. So we're going to do that by looking at trends that we see are going to be shaping 2025. Again, looking at these 5 steps you can take to strengthen your efforts and your organization's efforts. And ultimately, the common thread is really going to be looking at how can you embrace your role as a strategic leader, regardless of your title, coordinator, manager, something completely unrelated, but someone who also has volunteer engagement in your position description. Maybe you're a volunteer leader yourself, but we can all embrace our role as strategic leaders. So that's where we're going to be started. And in short, the takeaways are going to be to think about ways that you can and begin to implement ways that you can get in the know about the field, follow the field, meaning get in the know about trends and follow the field, whether it's volunteer engagement as a sector or your particular mission-based field. How can you do what you're doing today? Connect with peers, but do it in a way that's really going to help you move your strategy forward, which leads to the 4th one, my favorite. Those who've ever worked with me before know that I'm a total planning geek. So how can you make a plan and throughout embrace your role as a strategic leader? As Court mentioned, we also have partnered to put together a workbook, and so that will be emailed to all registrants for download with links as well that I'll be mentioning throughout. So you'll have some take-home opportunities to kind of make a personal plan based on some of the tips today.
Awesome. So Beth, talk to us. What is it all about planning proactively? Why is it important for 2025?
So planning is really about being thoughtful in order to make informed decisions. And when we are planful, intentional, and thoughtful, rather than just reactionary, we gain a lot of benefits. Our actions are informed and data informed, experience informed, and that way we can actually justify them more. And in theory, and I've seen in practice, actually lead to greater results. We also have the opportunity to make wise decisions about trends that we're aware of. So often, we are caught in the ways that we've always done things. And even if volunteer behaviors and motivations are shifting, we tend to stick with what we know, and we often end up working despite trends rather than leveraging them. That doesn't mean that we should follow every whim, but at least we should be thoughtful and intentional and informed about it. It's also a way to elevate your role as a leader of volunteer engagement strategy. Again, whether you're paid or unpaid staff, whether your title is director or chief engagement officer or volunteer coordinator or specialist or something else, but you engage volunteers, we have the opportunity and I think the obligation and responsibility to elevate our role. And ultimately, this is all about sustaining our organization through disruptions. There's lots of research out there that talks about organizations that strategically engage volunteers are more adaptable, sustainable, and capable of going to scale, regardless of the external disruptions and environmental chaos that might be happening. So this really is not about sustaining a program and keeping volunteers happy. Not that I'm opposed to keeping volunteers happy, but that should not be, that's pitting them as program participants. And we want them to be strategic partners in fulfilling our mission. And so it really is about engaging volunteer engagement as a strategy, and that will make your organization, help your organization be more adaptable despite whatever new trends are evolving. And ultimately, it's all about increasing impact. So those are the benefits of planning, in my view.
That's amazing, Beth. And can you just share, because I so appreciate your experience, your perspective. You get to work, on the inside with a lot of just a broad swath of organizations. What are you seeing, kind of behind the scenes that organizations are experiencing in 2025 when it comes to volunteer engagement? Just tell us a little bit about that experience that you're having.
And I love seeing all the chat and seeing where everyone's from. I love seeing we have a few international folks here. Thank you for joining. We also have quite a strong representation across the US and Canada, which is where I primarily work, occasionally further afield, but my work is mostly based in the US and Canada. And what I'm seeing is there are clearly in the first quarter of 2025, there are many organizations that are dramatically impacted, particularly around policy and funding. So for example, here in the US, organizations that work on immigration are shifting the focus of their mission because of shifting anticipated numbers of incoming immigrants. Funding, of course, is in question. Welcome. I see some very familiar names. Nice to see you all here. Brian, welcome. In any case, organizations are also seeing potential shifts in funding. Many already have had funding shifts. So some organizations are being dramatically affected. Others are simply anticipating potential changes or dealing with uncertainty. And, to some extent that may feel different this year. It's often the case. And certainly in the last 5 years, there has been tremendous uncertainty for many organizations, whether it's health, safety net services, education services, as policy shifts, as economies shift, safety net services become ever more vital for certain organizations. So they may expect reduced funding, but increase in demand for services. So how do you handle that? And then, frankly, there are many organizations that are just moving ahead business as usual, and that's great to see. And yet, I also believe it's really important to continue, because of that research, to continue to engage volunteers strategically. We also are, it seems a little bit like ancient history, but we're still just 5 years out from the onset of the COVID pandemic here in North America. And organizations are still recovering or rebounding from that in terms of programmatically mission delivery, and access to volunteers and volunteer numbers. And so it's an ever-changing landscape, and rebounding does not mean going back to what life was like in December of 2019. It means taking what we learned and adapted, and also addressing trends that were already well in the works pre-2020, but that were accelerated due to the pandemic. I did a site visit last story and then we'll move on, but I did a site visit last night for a statewide agency here in Colorado. I'm based in Denver, Colorado, and it was a wonderful site visit to look at their accreditation as a service enterprise, which is a credential that designates excellence in volunteer engagement. And at the end, one of the volunteer leaders who was part of this whole audit said, Beth, what do you recommend that we really focus on? And they're an excellent organization, model engagement strategies. And I said, really the best thing is that you have embedded evaluation and adaptability into your culture. In fact, it was volunteers that in 2022 said staff is so still stressed out trying to figure out how to manage in this new world. With COVID, they're a cultural organization with 9 sites around our state with visitor centers, museums, et cetera. And the volunteers said, we'd like to take the time to interview staff and write a report about the long-term lessons we're learning from these shifts. And that Silver Linings report remains, I think, a great model for, it's not for an outsider to tell you what you need to do. Embed this awareness and strategic thinking. And as I'll talk later, this ability to triage and adapt. And I just love that it was volunteers led, volunteer delivered, and volunteer promoted that really made that report happen. So those are some of the things I'm seeing.
What an incredible initiative. I love that.
That's
So,
great.
Beth, tell us, what are some of the top challenges that we're seeing in 2025 when it comes to volunteer engagement?
So certainly we would be remiss if we didn't list one of the top challenges, which is time and a perceived limitation on time. Too little time to tune into trends, though, to the, how many do we have? Almost 200 folks on this call today. Thank you for taking at least 50 minutes out of your day to join us for this. But it often feels really hard to lift your head up out of the weeds and really take the time to look at strategy. In fact, in this year's Volunteer Management Progress Report, which is a global report put together by Volunteer Pro, and I think we have a link that can be shared to this Volunteer Management Progress Report. Time remains one of the top challenges from among those volunteer engagement professionals from around the world who were surveyed for this. Additionally, planning, even as much as I love it, it is often a challenge. The tyranny of the urgent often takes precedence over planning, and so it's especially important to take the time and also think about where does volunteer engagement fit in your organizational structure and in your organization's strategic plan. I'm working with a zoo right now that engages hundreds and hundreds of volunteers, and it's interesting to see if and how that strategy, which involves not just public interpretation, but also behind the scenes animal care and all marketing and fundraising, is it mentioned in the strategic plan? Is it not? Are volunteers included in the planning process beyond board members who are volunteers as well? Planning is really important, and many organizations pivoted in the last 5 years and are in the process of updating their strategic plan. But it's often a common challenge to get volunteer engagement integrated into that rather than saying, here's our plan, now let's get some volunteers to help with it. And then finally, there's the perceived limitations of those of us in these roles as volunteer engagement leaders, volunteer engagement professionals. Often, not always, but often, these positions are expected to influence, but not necessarily from a place of authority. I love it when I see organizations with chief engagement officers or volunteer engagement reporting right up to the chief of people and culture or HR heads, but often that's the exception, not the rule. And one of the best lessons I ever had was from a town neighboring where I am, Boulder, Colorado. I saw someone from Boulder on this call today. Welcome. And Amy Kane, who still works there and who led one of their strategic planning for volunteer engagement initiatives about 7 or 8 years ago, said her most important lesson was not to wait to be invited to the leadership table. She invited leadership to her table. So there are challenges, but there are also ways to overcome them. And I hope we'll share some of those today.
Incredible. So, what are some of the outcomes that volunteer leaders can expect if they spend time focusing on strengthening engagement with some of these 5 steps we're going to dive into?
Increased public trust. I worked with an organization in New Hampshire. They're a grant making organization, and they really worked to engage volunteers in new ways, particularly volunteer leaders, in their grants review and grants allocation process. And their goal was, in fact, to increase public trust in their grant making decisions. And by engaging volunteer leaders who could increase efficiency, communications, and also the transparency around funding decisions, they did in fact increase public trust. So engaging volunteers and doing so, thinking about this strategically, can really increase public trust in your organization at a time when in recent years that has often been eroded in public discourse. It also is a way, of course, to bring in labor, talent, and connections. I think about an organization that we just are in the process of wrapping up, a conservancy, a countywide land conservancy. And of course, they engage volunteers in public interpretation and some advocacy, but through their work on strategic engagement, they also engaged a volunteer who has expertise in Salesforce to help them with their database, both for funding and eventually, or for fund development and eventually for volunteer engagement as well. So whether you're using Get Connected or another system, there may be volunteers who can help you build capacity and expertise, or that of your colleagues, in how to leverage technology to better manage your strategy. So bringing in talent. It's also a way to inspire ambassadors. I think about a great organization we worked with a while ago in Florida, Seniors in Service of Tampa, and they had, their whole mission is to engage, you can tell based on their name, seniors in service, but they also created new roles beyond direct service, literacy, and mentoring volunteers. They engage volunteers as ambassadors. And so you can formally create ambassadorial roles for volunteers to help spread your mission and recruit volunteers. Or you can also recognize and equip the current cadre of volunteers with tools to help them spread your message more widely. And finally, people give their time where they give their money, and they give their money where they give their time. So we know that volunteers are resource multipliers. And whether they're giving directly or they're inspiring others, or as my site visit last night indicated, volunteers were engaged by the philanthropy department to make thank you calls to those who made donations on Colorado Gives Day. Many states have a Gives Day, like a Giving Tuesday, that's statewide, and volunteers were engaged for the first time to thank folks for their donations. And that's a great way to, again, create that personal touch and hopefully transform one-time to ongoing donors as well. So lots of different benefits from strengthening engagement, regardless of what's happening in the field.
Absolutely. I really love that, Beth, because I feel like the volunteers you already have that are so dedicated are the best at referral, word of mouth recruitment and marketing for your organization. They can really be empowered to get out in the community and spread the word. So let's go ahead and dive into what are these 5 steps that you're going to share with us today about strengthening volunteer engagement here in 2025.
So first is get in the know. the landscape of volunteerism and our sector as a whole is changing at a rapid pace. There's lots of different reports that you can access. Um, uh, uh, um, Volunteer Canada has great data available on their giving and participation rates. I'm sorry I didn't share that link, but I can try and look it up at one point and get it out there. Annalise, in the US, we have the AmeriCorps data piece, the Volunteering and Civic Life in America report. And what we saw from that report that was released last fall about 2023. There's a little delay here. So the latest data, the latest year for which we have data on volunteering in the United States is from 2023. And we were very glad to see that volunteering was rebounding from the unsurprising significant drop due to COVID related restrictions. But we need to also like dive a little deeper. What's happening in your own region? And also what does it really mean when we see that percentages of volunteering were going back up? What can we learn about some of the more detailed data, like the fact that while volunteering rates have rebounded, again, in the US and many places around the world, we also see that the amount of time any one person on average gives in a year continues to go down. So volunteers continue, and this was a pre-COVID, this is not COVID driven. Maybe it was COVID accelerated, but it was happening well before COVID. Volunteers continue to be seeking short-term and episodic opportunities. So you can work against that. And certainly I think we had a CASA on here and we have a couple other folks on here that, yes, there are certain roles for which a year-long commitment and extensive training are mandated, and that makes sense. For many other organizations, though, how can we leverage this trend and not just work against it and hit our head against the proverbial brick wall by thinking about how can we restructure rules? We also need to think about trends in the workforce. So what's happening among our staffing that is also affecting our organization's ability to effectively engage volunteers? Annalise is going to share a report, Beyond Burnout. There we go. Thank you, Annalise. Beyond Burnout, Workforce Trends in the Nonprofit Sector. Which in short talked about, the tighter, and this was written in December of 2024. Even then, talking about the tightening of resources can slow our organizational growth. Remote work is here to stay. If you aren't engaging volunteers virtually, and yet some of your staff works remotely, you're missing the boat on access to great talent to be able to access volunteers and work with staff remotely. We're not tied into that. How can we trust volunteers if we can't look over their shoulders? Well, how do we trust staff if we can't look over their shoulders? So we need to extend that trust to our unpaid members of our workforce. There's also changing expectations in around career, which is a nice way of saying we're experiencing high turnover. And when we have high turnover among staff, we have the opportunity to gain new skills and new energy. And we also lose institutional memory about and culture around how to engage volunteers. I've told this story a number of times in recent years. We worked with an organization a few years ago that, due to COVID, had to lay off 15% of their paid staff, which of course this was in 2020. And of course, that's a very significant percentage, but even more significant was the fact that when they looked at who comprised that 15%, it was over 90% of the staff members who worked directly with volunteers. So it was frontline staff who were engaging with volunteers regularly, which meant they were losing that culture and institutional knowledge and needed to really think about, how do we onboard new staff now that we're regrowing, and put volunteer engagement into job descriptions, into new employee orientation? How do we build that in? And even if you're not seeing that sort of loss, and I hope you're not, there's still a lot of turnover. So how do you embed volunteer engagement into, so that you're not working against this trend? You're saying, okay, we have staff turnover. How do we make sure that new staff recognize that volunteers are a vital part of our organization? So recognizing workforce trends and understanding changing volunteer rates and patterns, I think, is one of the first thing to go to. And then the last piece is also to understand funding around volunteer engagement. Where does volunteer engagement align or not align with your organizational investments? Is it budgeted? Do you need to make the case to invest in volunteer engagement? And Annalise will share a report from UJA Federation of New York's Time for Good, capturing 10 years of volunteer impact report. This is a great case study of how investing in volunteer engagement by a funder, but it also is about the impacts of those, in the end, relatively modest investments in the grantees themselves, have made to help create lasting impacts for organizations that received grants and assistance and not personal, but organizational investments in volunteer engagement. So the more we can talk about these trends and try and get on board with this trend of increasing funding for volunteer engagement as well, is going to help you be able to be a more effective advocate within your organization. So that's number one. What are some of the ways you're using to measure impact? Oh, Lisa, that is a great question, which is a whole webinar in and of itself. I will just briefly say that I think it would be great to look at the Time for Good report. And I will also put in the chat the name of one of the best researchers and writers, and a wonderful professional partner of mine, Dr. Sue Carter-Kale, whose research is on the varied ways to reveal volunteer impact. She has a blog, Volunteer Commons. I can't remember if it's .com or .org. You can look that up. And Mava also has great tools on, oh good, thank you, Polly, on post-pandemic volunteerism and also impacts as well. Great question. And hopefully some of these tools will get to it, and maybe I'll reveal a few things. But I do love the trend in volunteer impact reporting, which is very much beyond just hours and dollar value, beyond the wage replacement, and really looking at community or mission-centered impact communications. What are the impacts to the volunteers, to the people being served or receiving, participating in programs, and to your organization in terms of capacity building? So I won't go down that path too far, but great little detour there. Another piece, two more of these steps that I think are really important are following the field and also doing exactly what you're doing today, connecting with peers. So let's talk a little bit about following the field. We have seen a lot of very exciting changes in the field of volunteer engagement, with some of our many influential organizations welcoming new leadership, others choosing to merge, others clarifying their mission and focus. So I'll name a couple of them that might be worth checking out and tuning in with the sector to understand where you can find resources, inspiration, and potentially partnerships as well. Here in the States, the Association of Leaders in Volunteer Engagement welcomes its first full-time executive director, Nicole Smith. And so that organization is really shoring itself up to help leaders of volunteer engagement as a profession, and has already been doing some really interesting advocacy at the federal level as well to recognize volunteer engagement as a profession. They partner with the Canadian Association as well of volunteer professionals on things like hybrid conferences, et cetera. So it's great to connect with your national association. We also have a new era for investing in volunteer engagement, beginning as the Initiative for Strategic Volunteer Engagement, which was a coalition of organizations that came together a couple of years ago um, to close the funding gap in volunteer engagement in investments. It was through a partnership of visionary funders and national nonprofits, and that ISVE, the Initiative for Strategic Volunteer Engagement, recently was adopted, taken over by the independent sector. So stay tuned. There's some exciting things happening in that regard with conferences and resources, and it's nice to get that elevated platform to talk about the importance of investing in volunteer engagement. Again, on a more international level, Volunteer Match announced a merger with Idealist. So just lots of different things happening in the field. And of course, as many of you are already noting as we transition to number 3, connecting with peers, there are some great local and regional associations. Chelsea added the in the Pacific Northwest and in Oregon, and there's also I'm forgetting the Northwest and forgetting the initials, but anyway, there's great regional and local volunteer engagement, professional roundtables and associations. They may be called DOVIAs, Directors of Volunteers and Agencies. They may be called AVAs, Associations of Volunteer Administrators. They go by a lot of different names, but connecting with peers, there's nothing more powerful than connecting with peers to share, learn, and inspire each other. So you can attend national service conferences, international conferences like Points of Light in June. There are state and regional conferences. MAVA has one that they're just pulling together. I mean, they've been working on it. It'll happen in mid-June, I think 16th through 18th. I'm sure that Polly, who's on the call, can share a link. MAVA, the Minnesota Alliance for Volunteer Advancement, is a great regional, but really national conference. Texas is another. TVMC, the Texas Volunteer Management Conference, is another of the many kind of seemingly local, but really national reach conferences. And save the date for the hybrid conference, which will be in October of 2025, and also the 2026 National Summit on Volunteer Engagement pulled together by Alive in Sacramento, March 18th through 20th. So lots of conferences, and yet we also know that, of course, it doesn't have to be in person. You can also connect as you are today online. Many of these are hybrid, lots of great ways to informally connect within your own network as well. I'm talking about the volunteer engagement sector, but many of your industries, food insecurity, immigration, faith-based organizations, conservation, housing, literacy, government, policy, many of these organizations or sectors or mission areas have their own sets of conferences and their own network of volunteer engagement professionals that's really worth connecting with. And if it doesn't exist, you can organize it. The amazing Wendy, I think I'm getting it, Wendy Johnson from Indianapolis, shortly after COVID broke out, said, I'm going to put out a call to others with the Indianapolis Public Library. I'm going to put a call out to other library volunteer engagement professionals and see who wants to connect about this ever-changing field. That was in March of 2020. I believe every single Wednesday since then, more than 80 library volunteer engagement professionals across North America meet virtually on a Wednesday afternoon and connect on issues that are evolving. Wendy just put out a call, and now it's become part of the fabric of the way people do business. So I think there's nothing more important and powerful as Chris weighed in. Networking widens our perspectives, it builds resilience, it makes our sector more creative, and it reminds us we're not alone. And I think that is really important. What is the library network called? I don't know if it has a name, but I will put my email, if that's okay, with court. Hope I'm not totally overwhelmed, but if you want to email me, I'll make the introduction to Wendy. So those are numbers, what is that? I think 2 and 3. And let's get to number 4. So number 4, no surprise, it's like one of my favorites. Make a plan. When funding seems to change overnight or disaster hits, and many of you have been facing multiple disasters, whether they're fires in California or now all over the country, or floods as in Court's backyard. These crises often demand an all hands on deck approach, or maybe policy changes upend systems that we're used to work on. And we have this impulse to carry on as usual. But that temptation to avoid or overcommit or cling to old plans, really, it's understandable, but we need to not step back and hold on to old ways. We need to make room for clarity and care so we can move forward with thought and intention. I'm kind of paraphrasing a great quote from Mary Urquia, who wrote this strategy triage tool, which I know that Annalise will drop in the chat in a moment. Times like these deserve a plan, or they demand revisiting a plan through a triage process to assess it for continued relevance. So if you don't have, well, first, let me take a moment and just get a couple terms clear. What's the difference between an action plan and a strategic plan? So an action plan is often what we go to do. It's a to-do list, but we want to really focus on strategic plans that are tied to strategic goals, ideally to your organization's strategic goals. They're often longer term. They help us decide on resources moving forward. They're outcomes focused. They often have a vision, goals, objectives, a timeline, whereas they can inform action plans that will cascade out of a strategic plan. But they are in, from a strategic standpoint, more long-term and will, again, inform our decisions about resources and the actions that we take. So first, understand what a plan looks like. Then see how your plans for volunteer engagement can or do or should integrate with your organization's strategic priorities and pillars. And Annalise has shared a couple articles about how you can develop a strategic plan for volunteer engagement for your organization. And I think the key message of all of those writings are that this is not to be done alone. If you are creating a strategic plan, and I put that in quotes, alone, then it's not a strategic plan for volunteer engagement. It is your department's action plan. But if you engage representatives from other areas of your organization, and hopefully some volunteers as well, then you're able to really develop a strategic plan that looks at how the volunteer resource can be deployed to achieve all or most of your organization's priorities, whether it's financial stability, expanding reach, ensuring quality programs, whatever are the strategic priorities of your organization. If you already are lucky enough and wise and strategic enough to already have a plan, times may warrant triaging it. And that article that Annalise shared a few moments ago on the triage is something that you can hire a facilitator, like us, we do this with organizations, or you can self-facilitate it. It's a great self-guided tool that allows you to look at your plan and take a step back and say, what are the factors and assumptions this was based on and how have they changed? What might we need to let go of because they're no longer relevant? And what might we need to add in order to adapt to the ever-changing conditions of our field, since you've spent so much time getting in the know and following the field. So I think it's really important to recognize you don't have to do this alone. You can engage consultants, you can engage facilitators, you can engage volunteers to help you do it. And if you move forward with all of these, or even just a couple of these steps, you don't have to do it all, you will really be taking steps to embrace that mantle of leadership. and embrace your role not just as a manager of volunteers but as a leader of the strategy. And we're only going to touch on this briefly, but Get Connected by Galaxy Digital has a couple other sessions coming up, like one with Lori Gottlieb on leadership that is going to take this and really focus on it in much more depth. Another one with Faiza Van Zant from the Council of Certification in Volunteer Administration on competencies. So I'll just briefly say that as you update plans, meet with colleagues, attend convenings, remember that you are leading a vital strategy for mission fulfillment. And you can live that out by communicating your current strategic plans widely and lead discussions about how they advance your organization's priorities. Share reports and updates, including not just trends, but also your impact reports, which we touched on a little bit. How can you creatively and accurately and meaningfully share and reveal the impacts that volunteers have? And you can also present at networking events and conferences and publish your stories. Not only will be helping to strengthen impacts at your organization, but you'll be empowering others to do the same.
All right,
So
Beth.
go
How do we
ahead.
get
Jump in.
started? I was like, we've got some great steps here. And I know that folks are feeling a lot of energy. I can see it in the chat around these steps to strengthen volunteer engagement this year. How do we do it? How do we get started?
I gave 5 big, bold ideas, but really the message is start small. Pick one project or one area that, whether it's one of these steps or just one particular program or area in your organization to focus on. I'm a huge fan of piloting. I had someone tell me that word is already old school, so I don't know what to replace it with, but I still think it's very powerful to say we're going to pilot, we're going to try out, or we're going to focus. We're going to have a focus area and innovate in that area, and then test out our successes. It's kind of also a low risk way to make change. So develop a plan for one area, pick one thing like your professional networking, and start there. But schedule it and hold yourself accountable. If you lead a team, then as a team, decide how you might divide and conquer a couple of these steps, and then build momentum and keep it going. So I think a big piece is ensuring that, maybe a place to start would be to just schedule quarterly check-ins on how to strengthen your work in 2025. Use today, end of Q1, as a starting point, and think about what a couple steps you can implement, and then check back in at the end of June, check back in at the end of September, doing the math, and end of December, and plan for 2026 then. So accountability is really key, but also don't feel overwhelmed. Start small and see where you can begin to make difference, and share it widely within your organization.
Incredible. Just a little review here for us, Beth, the 5 steps and the bonus resource that Beth created for everyone here. I'll let you share about that a bit.
Yeah, so this is something that can help you. It's just a little bit of a workbook that summarizes some of the things we talked about today. So this is something, it'll be, again, I think the link will be emailed out, and you can download it and use this 5 steps to strengthen in 2025 as a conversation guide as you work through it with your team, maybe with peers at one of these local networking events like Adovia or a roundtable. And or just use it personally, and that can also be an accountability piece for you. So we hope that this will help you take these ideas and put them into action.
Excellent. And Beth, do you have a little bit of time to take some questions here at the end?
I certainly do. I've been trying to follow, but maybe you could highlight a couple of questions if there were some from the past already that I haven't seen, or popping in. I'm kind of tap dancing a little to see if folks want to type in new questions, but I'll turn it back to you, Court, to MC this part.
So we've got one question that came in just a moment ago. Said, I love how you said invite leadership to my table and not wait for them to welcome you to their table. Could you give small, tangible ways that we could do to accomplish this? because we want leadership to help message how important volunteers are and how they are a part of our team. Ideas on how to approach our CEO. We meet with department directors quarterly and try to bring things up in staff meetings, but it's better coming from leadership.
I love that. It's a very real and common conundrum. So I love that it went on and said that, you do meet with, it sounded like more laterally, you meet with peers. Oh, good. Thank you, Annalise, for reposting that. That you meet with peers quarterly. I think one of the first things is, I don't know your organizational structure, but to whom do you report that then reports to the CEO? And I think a big piece is first, honoring that hierarchy and equipping your leader, your divisional leadership with really powerful impact statements and perhaps a case statement, a need statement around why, what is the ask? Do you want them to just be a greater supporter of volunteer engagement? Do you want them to show that support through greater investment and budget? For staffing and other resources, what's the ask? What shift do you want? Because that's going to guide what your communications are. So if you just want to inform them, then do a great infographic, ask to get on an agenda, and to provide a year-end update. But I also think it's important to know what your ask is, and first go through your divisional leadership, but also, depending on the culture of the organization, share that, maybe ask them to review something that you plan to put out to the community, work with marketing to be able to share these impacts and outcomes. So I think that, how do you invite them to your table? First, you need to make the case of what you're already doing and what you need and what you're asking for them, and then share that with them. I also think if the organization has a strategic plan, formatting your impacts and any asks around how engaging volunteers ties to the identified strategic priorities of the organization shifts volunteer engagement from a program that serves volunteers to a strategic resource on behalf of the organization to achieve the organization's goals. So that's a way to frame it, whether it's in a PowerPoint, in an email or memo, or in some sort of infographic. I think that's how to get the attention. One of the ways to get attention to leadership. Hey, Christy. Great to see so many familiar names and faces that I can picture. What else is there, Court?
We've got a new question about recruitment. My organization is struggling with volunteer recruitment because our opportunities are during the week and can be posted last minute. Any suggestions for how to approach that might align with some of these engagement steps that you're talking about today?
Well, my first response, I'll keep it to just two immediate responses. My first reaction is there a way that you can be working with colleagues to proactively guard against last minute requests? Because that seems to be not the most efficient. I don't know the mission area. It's okay. But sometimes we know things can come up urgently, but we also know that in more cases than not, working with colleagues about helping them plan and overcoming that myth, debunking that myth that as volunteer engagement leaders, you have some magic Dr. Seuss-like machine in the basement and can put in some numbers and poof, out comes a bunch of, fluffy yellow volunteers. It just doesn't work that way. So how can you work with colleagues to help them be more planful about potential volunteer needs? That said, if you are in a world where there are urgent, unexpected, or at least last minute needs, then I would recruit like a quick response team, an action team that could be on call. They are available during the times that these needs come up, and they know that they will be receiving. They're already pre-vetted and pre-trained, and they know that they are on call to respond if they're available on short-term notice. So I would create a quick action team, or you could come up with a little clever name for it, but that would be how I would do it if your mission and structure is such that you can't avoid last minute.
Yeah, that's incredible, Beth. We've seen that be successful for some of the organizations in our Get Connected network. And they definitely have like different lists of volunteers who are prepared and ready for last minute requests. And that's what they've signed up for. And so that is kind of part of that planning aspect that you mentioned. I think we might have time for another question. So if anyone has a question, um, you can drop that in the chat. I know we had a little bit of question earlier surrounding planning for different types of volunteer roles, specifically, as you mentioned earlier, expanding to that virtual volunteer type of role. And so I'm curious if you have any insights into how somebody could do that for a program that maybe traditionally has only had in-person types of volunteer roles.
Right. So, there's lots of different ways we can engage volunteers virtually, and it obviously has to work for your mission and the type of role. But I think a big piece is if we're looking at roles that have traditionally been in person, it's always worth asking the question, can this be done offsite? And if so, do we have the resources to support it? So is the issue that this is say an administrative volunteer who helps in your philanthropy or advancement department, and they don't have remote access to a database? Can you work with your IT and your digital security team to grant that access with the right protection? So can we remove barriers to working offsite? Second, what are the roles that we never really thought about that could be done offsite and during off hours? So back to the group that I did the site visit for last night, ironically and very conveniently, in January of 2020, they were beginning to pilot a program where they would invite volunteers virtually to connect with their archives division to transcribe digital archives. It started with women's suffrage documentation, and it's moved on to a lot of different things. And there are now volunteers all around the world that are connecting with History Colorado and providing archival transcriptions and projects that they thought were going to take years took 2 months because they had people doing that sort of transcription. Those volunteers don't need to go through background checks or other things that on-site volunteers who work with children do. So they created a whole different category of volunteers that were really, really powerful and made it far more accessible. In fact, many of court-appointed community service volunteers are engaging in that role, and many have stayed on even once they fulfilled their hours. So I think it's about looking at what are ways that we might be able to garner support from individuals. There's also leadership roles. So I saw someone was here from a hospice. We worked with a group in New Hampshire that, like so many hospice networks, engage amazing volunteers who serve as vigil volunteers, providing presence to an individual and their family when they enter the medically diagnosed stage of actively dying. And that obviously is something that has to be done in person. But the vigil team leader is a virtual role. And there's a vigil team leader for each week of the month who is the one who helps with scheduling and checking in with the vigil volunteers, many of whom don't even go to the hospice facility because these are individuals who are being served in their homes. So are there leadership roles, check-in calls, thank you calls like with philanthropy that can all be done virtually? That are really strong capacity builders. And again, I would start small with one or two. And then, as we saw in New Hampshire, and Tanya, their amazing volunteer coordinator, she said 2 months into having these vigil team leaders, people were looking over the cubby saying, how do I get some of those volunteer leaders? I want some of those volunteer leaders because that's really going to help with my capacity. So I hope that I didn't get too far afield. Hope that answered that question. Anything
Yeah,
else, Court?
I really love the creativity and flexibility of that too. It gives people an opportunity to engage that really want to support your mission, even if they're not able, because sometimes virtual volunteers aren't able to be on site, but they do have time that they can give. So, any other last questions? We have like a couple minutes left before we can log off today. Um, it seems
Just
like Go ahead.
add a throwback to virtual volunteering. It also could be remote volunteering.
Yeah.
So I remember many years ago, I won't tell too personal story, but there was a point where I was more homebound than I wanted to be many years ago. And I was able to go pick up resources from an organization that I supported and go home and take a week and, put together binders and do all that and just get them in a box and bring them back. It doesn't have to be something that is completely digital, although that makes it a lot easier. You could also give people materials to do things at home or in their office and bring it back. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, go ahead, Bart.
Like that asynchronous volunteering. It's like you can do it on your own time. You have a week to complete it. I love that also. We've
Yeah.
seen some really successful models for that for community gardens. A lot of them are asynchronous.
Nice. Nice. Victoria says lots of virtual opportunities, agency lunch and learn, card writing project. I love that. I see that with National MS has done that too. Great ideas. So check out the
Mhm.
chat.
Yeah, absolutely incredible. I want to take a couple moments to say thank you to everyone who attended today for taking an hour out of your day here on a gorgeous March day, hopefully, and to really engage in these 5 steps with Beth. I want to say a big thank you to Beth as well for spending time with us and bringing us this presentation today. And we definitely want to keep the conversation going because we know that 1 hour can't meet all the need that we have. So we're here regularly every month hosting these conversations, and we hope to keep seeing you all come back again. As Beth mentioned earlier, we do have a volunteer leadership and internal advocacy series that we're doing with Lori Gottlieb. Part 2 of that series is next Tuesday, and you can join us for that. It's not too late to join if you haven't already registered. You can catch up with the recording and join us live for session 2. We also have an incredible session coming up next Wednesday with Severina Ware, who's also a CBA, and that will be on volunteer recognition. So I very much hope to see you all there as well. And just want to say a big thank you to Beth. Always love having the privilege of spending time with you and with our other volunteer leaders too. So thank you, Beth.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me. Good luck, everyone. Thank you so much.
And we will see you all in the email. You will get a copy of the presentation and also the workbook that Beth created to help you get started with these 5 steps to volunteer engagement strengthening in 2025. And yeah, we'll log off here in just a minute. But thank you so much for being with us today. Thank you. Thanks, Annalise, too, for dropping all of those fantastic links. We'll make sure that you get Beth's resources, the links that Annalise shared. Those will be in the follow-up as well. We want to make sure everyone can access all the reports and the amazing articles that Beth put together for us today. All right. Thank you so much, Beth.
See you soon.
Bye, everyone. We'll see you next week.
30
Bye,
minutes
Beth.
here.